on Father's Day. Next year, probably not. I don't do it every year, don't do it every time for various reasons. But this year, I wanted to do that. And I'll be honest with you, I'm preaching on Father's Day because I preached on Mother's Day. And I won't make anybody mad, right? So that's why I'm doing that like that. A long time ago, many years ago, I listened to a sermon by a man named Mark Driscoll, who now he's a pastor and author who he serves out in Arizona now. And he was preaching through 1st and 2nd Peter. And the sermon I was listening to was on this passage I just read, 1 Peter 3:7. And I just wanted you to know that this sermon is loosely based on his outline. And I can't remember who said it, but it's a saying amongst preachers that I may use someone else's bullets, but I'm going to use my own gun. So, yes, I am borrowing from him, but know that this has my fingerprints on it as well. Now, ladies, even though this sermon is going to be primarily directed to men, and specifically fathers, I want to encourage you to pay attention because I believe these things do affect you, of course. So I encourage you to listen as we explore, again, what it means to be a godly husband, a godly father, and ultimately just a godly man. When we look at the Bible, we are given out of the gate an example to follow. We're given Adam. And Adam, obviously, once he plunged himself into sin, we see that. We see that he's not perfect. He's not a perfect person after the fall. But there's something he does that I think does serve an example, and that is he is the original covenant maker with Eve. And that's the first thing we see is that marriage is a covenant. We see this in a lot of places, and again, I don't want to read. I didn't want to read every reference or every. We'd be here all morning and into the afternoon if I read every reference to this. But I wanted to point an important reference, and it comes from the book of Malachi, or as a friend of mine, in fact, he was my mentor in seminary. He would call it the book of Malachi, the Italian prophet. I don't think it's pronounced that way, but anyway, Malachi. Chapter 2, verse 14 says this, "But you say, why does he not?" They're talking about judgment there. "Because the Lord was witness between you and the wife of your youth, to whom you have been faithless, though she your companion and your wife by covenant." The key word there, of course, is covenant. Now, just to give you a touch of background on that passage, the Hebrews, during this time frame, the Hebrew men were leaving or forsaking their covenant wives to pursue Canaanite women and abandoning their wife of their youth and trading in for a younger model, a foreign model. And unfortunately, we still see that happening sometimes today. And the point is that they were breaking covenant. Covenants are not contracts. That's something different. If there's a couple of people in here today that can vouch for this, but when I take couples through premarital counseling, I'll remind them this is not a contract. Contract are multi-sided. They're give and take. There's conditions. There's if you do this, then I'll do this, and if you do that, then I'll do this. Covenants are different. Covenants are written by one party. It's not give and take. It is these are the terms of the covenant. You either accept it or you don't, but here are the terms. And guess what? Husband and wife don't write the covenant. It's been written for us. It's been written by God. And it's a covenant of, it's three. Three parties are taking part of this covenant. And the vows you make, yes, you're making vows to each other, but ultimately you're making vows to God. And He is the covenant writer. He's the covenant maker. And so when you break the covenant, you not only break the terms of the other party, you're breaking it with God as well. And that's something important to keep in our minds when we enter this covenant. God is the one who determines the terms of the covenant, not man, and therefore He will enforce them. But, now that being said, the husband is the covenant leader. Let me give you some references here, some scripture to back this up. And again, it's all over the place, but I'm just going to give you three here this morning. First one comes from Genesis chapter 2. It says, "Then the Lord God said, It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him. Now, one comment before we move to the next one here. This is the first time in Scripture that God said something wasn't good. Up until that point, everything was good. He created things. He looked at it and he said, and it was good, and it was good, and it was good. He created light. He created the sea. He created the earth. He created plants, and he created animals, and everything was good. And then he looked at man and said, it's not good for man to be alone. So he created woman. He made him a helper. In 1 Corinthians 11, we have Paul weighing in on this. Now, it's interesting, Paul here is not married, yet he speaks about marriage, and he speaks about marriage with authority. And it's kind of like here that, I became a father in 2005. Did I preach on being a father before that? Did I preach on these issues? Of course I did. And I preached with authority. Why? Because the authority is not with me. The authority is with God and His Word. And it doesn't take a married person to talk about marriage. It doesn't take a father to talk about fathers. I'm not a mother, never will be, but I can talk about mothers. Why? Because I believe the authority of God gives me that authority. So Paul here, again, not married, says this. Now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions I have delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Now, when we talk about this relationship between husband and wife, we often want to put it in terms of adversarial kind of things. In fact, much of our, quote, reality TV, by the way, I don't believe it's reality. If it is reality, I'm very, very sad. But anyway, that's another sermon. But a lot of what reality TV, what makes you want to think about this is just off. It's just off. The ultimate relationship is as husbands, we are answerable to God. And yes, our wives are called to be a helper to us and to serve a subordinate role. That is true. But it has more to do with responsibility than authority. And if men would understand that, it would, I think, transform our marriages. That ultimately we have to answer to God for these things. And of course, the classic passage is found in Ephesians. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and himself its Savior. Now the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. But then he talks about husbands. Look at verse 25. He says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church. Because we are members of his body, therefore a man should leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, but I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. Now, I don't even know if you caught that, but it seems to me that Paul, and I think directly God, has a lot more to say to us husbands and men than he does to women. I mean, with women, it's very simple and short and to the point. Wives, you should submit to your husbands, as Christ said. But then he goes on and on and on talking about the men. Why does he do that? Well, maybe because he created us, that God knows that men need a little bit more instruction than do women. I don't know. Maybe we're just made that way, wired that way. But it seems to me that that's exactly what he does. Well, what makes this a challenge? What makes this problematic? What makes this difficult? Well, because sin entered into the world. And sin, what we don't realize maybe sometimes is that sin affects everything. Sin has damaged everything. The reason we can't have perfect relationships in this world is because sin is in those relationships. Because sin is in us. Because of sin, everything has been cursed. Therefore, everything needs to be redeemed, and because of that, everything we do needs Jesus. Our only hope is in Jesus. Sin is a resulting curse, again, is what makes marriage difficult. Now, I don't know everybody in the world. I'm sure you don't either. But I have never met anybody who would say in all truth and honesty, that they have a perfect marriage or a perfect spouse. We're flawed. We're hindered. We may have a healthy marriage, and I think that's what we ought to strive for, is healthy relationships, healthy marriages. But to say that we're going to have a perfect one on this side of heaven, not going to happen. Why? Because we're flawed people. And we have to make the best way. And that's what I encourage. Again, young people who are entering these types of relationships, if you think you're not going to have to work at it, think again. You're deluding yourself. Marriage is, and I learned this from my dad, if it's worth doing right, and it's worth putting what? Effort into it. And the same is true of marriage. That's our first model that we get is Adam. But you know what? The problem is we get several false models. Let me talk about two things here. And the first thing is this: sins of commission. That's a fancy way of saying doing what we are not supposed to do. Okay, that's sins of commission. We are committing those sins. We're not doing, we're doing something rather that we're not supposed to do. Let me give you, and then again, this comes from Mark. Let me give you some examples of this and how that plays out in these relationships, specifically men doing this. There's the macho man, which means there's nothing feminine at all about him. And by that we mean they're above doing dishes. They're not going to change diapers. They're not going to do anything that would remotely make them be seen in that kind of tender role. Now again, I think this has become less problematic over the years. We've kind of woken up to the fact that just because you like to cook, thank you very much, that that's nothing wrong with that. That's actually a good thing. And you guess what? You can change a diaper or two. It's not going to kill you. I always thought about this. I like to hunt, and there's a downside of hunting, or a problematic side of hunting, and that is once you actually get the deer, you got to deal with it, right? And when I first started out hunting, the guy I hunted with, we did everything. We processed it ourselves, and that meant gutting it, skinning it, and all that. And I remember thinking the first time now you hunters will appreciate this, first time I ever gut shot a deer and had to deal with that, I thought to myself, this has got to be the worst thing I have ever done in terms of, smell, okay? And I always thought to myself, if you can gut a deer, you can change a diaper, okay? I would take a diaper, hands down, twice on Sunday versus that. It's okay. It's not going to kill you to do these things. In fact, I think you ought to want to do these things because that's part of raising children. So there's the macho man who wants nothing to do with anything that a mom would do. Well, there's the success and money-driven man, and he is driven by money and things and possessions, and he thinks that's what makes him a man, is having things. I was told a story, a deacon in my last church in Lincoln, he was a pharmacist, and he had a friend who was a pharmacist. In fact, it was in the Montgomery area. I don't know the man's name, his friend, but he said the problem with his friend was that he was very driven by money, and he had a very successful pharmacy to the point that he really needed to add help. He needed to hire another pharmacist to kind of cover it. But he said, I don't want to give up the money. If I hire another pharmacist, and that's money out of my pocket, I'm not willing to do that. So he worked and worked and worked and worked and worked. Well, he had kids. What happened to the kids? Well, the kids the mom raises them, and there you go. And when they leave, they leave. They have nothing to do with dear old dad because dad was never there. He provided for them. They went to private school. They had all the nice things. They had nice cars. They had things, but they didn't have what they needed, and that was dad. And we see that with the success and money-driven man. There's the angry man. Of course, unfortunately, we have too many cases of this where he is violent and abusive, and for him, it's all about domination. It's all about being the guy, and to the point of if you threaten his status or his position, he reacts violently. And unfortunately, our our state is filled with cases, and our court system are filled with cases of this type man. Well, maybe not that guy, but there's another kind of guy, and this is a little more subtle, but nonetheless, I think, wrong, and that is the boss man. He is controlling, but not violent. In reality, he thinks he answers to no one but himself, and it's going to be his way or the highway. All of these are sins of commission. These are things we do that we ought not to do. But then there are also sins of omission. That's doing something or not doing something that you are supposed to do. And I would dare say most of us probably deal with this more than the other. Not doing what we're supposed to do. Because this is, quite frankly, this is the core root of this is laziness. I just don't want to do it. I don't want to put the effort, so I'm not going to do it. There's the guy who never grows up. He's childlike. He marries for the reason so he doesn't have to take care of himself. Unfortunately, there are men like this who get raised by mama, and mama does everything for them, and then they get married, and guess what? Wife just kind of fits into that role, and therefore they don't know how to do anything that the wife does for them. If the wife goes away for a week, the clothes pile up, the dishes pile up, and, well, actually, no, the dishes don't pile up because there are no dishes because he's eating TV dinners all week because he doesn't know how to cook. You know, there's that guy. There's the guy who is like a tree. He's there, but not really. He's not engaged with his family. He's not engaged with his wife. He's there. He's faithful, but he's really not there because he's not engaging himself in any real way with his family or his relationship with God. But then there's the guy who's the hyper spiritual. Unfortunately, I've met these guys. They're guys who talk a good game, but they hide behind spiritual cliches, and if you dig a little deeper, there's not much there. In other words, their spirituality and their goodness and their faithfulness is only skin deep. And if you get beyond that, then they're just not there. There's no commitment. There's no real spirituality there other than what's on the surface. And then there's the guy who just wants to have fun. He's liked by all, but he's respected by none. He's the life of the party, but you dare not trust him with anything because he's irresponsible and he's not going to follow through with it. Well, those are the false models, and I mentioned the first model, but here we talk about the best model, and that's Jesus. I really probably should put here the triune God, but I'm not going to talk much about the Holy Spirit at this point, even though I think there is that aspect of it. But we have God the Father and we have Jesus the Son, and both of these serve as a model for fatherhood. How is that? Well, or at least I should say a model of manhood. Maybe that's a better expression. God is interesting. God could have revealed himself in any way he had chosen, right? He has that freedom. He is independent. He doesn't need our permission. He doesn't need our existence even. He's independent from us. And he could have chosen to reveal himself any way he wanted to, but how does he choose to do this? He reveals himself what? As a father. He wants us to understand that relationship. He wants us to understand his character in this way, or he would not have revealed himself this way. This is why I'm bothered by, and I'm not going to get real specific here, but I'm bothered by people, writers, authors, who want to put God in a different light. And in doing so, they present him as feminine, or they present him as this and that. I'm bothered by that because, quite frankly, at the end of the day, that is not how God did it. And whether you had a bad father, a lousy father, I'm not as concerned with as the fact that you see God as the right father, as the good father he reveals himself to be. He is the benchmark, not the bad father you may or may not have had. My dad, I speak highly of him now, but there was a time where I didn't respect him as much as I do now. A lot of that has to do with absence, I'm sure. Well, but I see him in a different light now, but I would be the first one to tell you, and Dad would have been the first one to tell you, he was not perfect. He was not the prime example. And he would be, I think, the first to say, you want an example of fatherhood, don't look to me, look to God. Because he, again, reveals himself that way. And it's no accident. He knew that we would need this example. And the question that we can ask here is, how does God love his children? Well, he sacrifices for them. He provides for their needs. And you know what? There's something we don't need to miss here, especially earthly fathers. He's not afraid to discipline them. In fact, we are told in the book of Hebrews, the reason he disciplines those whom he loves is because he loves them. Or he would not discipline them. John Kroll, many years ago, when I was high school, I guess, he spoke in my hometown at a church. And one time that my parents let me go to another church. They were kind of sticklers about that I be in my own church most of the time. But this was one time I was allowed to go and visit another church because John Kroll was speaking, and he talked way back then. He's been preaching the same message ever since then. There are two things your kids will never forgive you for, and that is A, not loving them, and B, not disciplining them. Because there are two sides of the same coin. If you want your kids to love and respect you, then you must discipline, show them what is right, and show them what is wrong. We have to do that if we truly love our children. So God does this. Well, how does Jesus love? Now, Jesus, of course, and I'm not of that persuasion that think that Jesus was somehow married. I think that is false. I think it's heretical to say that. Jesus was not married in a physical sense, but he is the husband. And we, the church, are his bride. So to say Jesus was married, well, Jesus was married in the sense that he has a covenant relationship with his people. And we can look at him as an example of what it means to be a godly husband. Why? Again, what does he do? Paul tells us what he did in Ephesians 25 when he makes this analogy between Christ and the church and husband and wife. He says, husbands, you want an example of how to love your wife? Look at how Jesus loved the church and was willing to die for the church. But not only that, his death accomplished something, and that was to make her holy. So husbands, our job, our responsibility is to help our wives be closer to God. That is job number one. There's something else, and again, I read this in that first passage. When I read 1 Peter 3 and verse 7, and you probably thought, we haven't even talked about that verse. Well, now we've come kind of full circle, and we come back to that verse. And there's a line there that Peter uses, a sentence where he says that husbands ought to honor their wives. Well, how do we do that? How do we honor our wives? And this is what we'll kind of close with, if you will, is these few things here. We honor them, and this is, by the way, this is a made-up word. Spell check didn't pick it up. I don't think it's a word, but that's okay. Sometimes we have to make words. We honor them maritally. What we mean by that is that we are faithful to our wife, and we enter marriage honorably. That's what it means, to be faithful to your wife. And again, I could dig down and deep into these things, but you know what we're talking about here. You need to honor the covenant. You make promises to each other, and you need to keep those promises. We honor them physically, and what we mean by that is to be strong for our wives, embrace her, and protect her. That's what our job is, and what our responsibility is. We can honor them emotionally by not fearing intimacy, but being proactive in creating it. And this doesn't, well, again, I got to keep it PG here, but this doesn't mean that we create opportunities for intimacy in a sexual sense. It means we create intimacy that is emotionally driven, not physically. And again, if I have to explain that even more, I can, but probably do that on an individual basis. But you know what I'm talking about here, because that goes back to one of the flaws that we have seen earlier, and that is the macho man who wants nothing to do with anything feminine, and that means romance. But if you love your wife, the only time they need to know it is not when you're wanting something from them, but they need to know it each and every day. We need to love them emotionally, honor them emotionally. Verbally, speak well to her and about her. I am thankful that I never heard my dad use the expression the old ball and chain. You know, you've probably heard that. I hope that's not how I hope that's not how people see their spouse. I know we joke about it sometimes, but sometimes people cannot see the humor. People don't see the humor. They see it for what it is, and that's something negative. But we need to honor them verbally and in public. Going back to the physical, real quick, wasn't going to mention this because I didn't want to embarrass my kids. But then again, it's Father's Day. I can embarrass them. It's my day, right? So close your ears. But one of the things that Sharon and I do on purpose is that we show affection to one another. Now, this promptly grosses them out, quote unquote. I think there's usually responses of "ew" or "go," I'm leaving or whatever. But we feel like you need to know what we're doing is proper and important, and they need to see it. We all learn by example. We all learn by following a model, and we want to model that for them. And all these things, to be honest with you. We need to honor them financially by providing for the family, being responsible, but also being generous. And again, we need to be responsible, yes. We need to be responsible to God and to make sure that things are done in a proper way. But at the same time, we can't be tightwads when it comes to money. And unfortunately, sometimes what happens in a situation where the husband works and the wife is committed to raising the kids and working strictly in the home, what happens sometimes is that dad can be kind of controlling and say, well, I earn the money, so I determine how it's spent. And that can become kind of an adversarial thing. We have to be careful to not do that, to not use that as a club to beat over our wife and kids with. We need to be responsible, yes, but generous at the same time. We need to love them and honor them practically. We need to consider her needs and serve her. We need to love and honor her parentally by being the shepherd of our family and taking responsibility for the spiritual nurturing of our children. Unfortunately, we see this a lot today. And it's getting worse. I'll be honest with you. It's getting worse. It's to some degree the church is responsible for this. But we've created a situation where we offer programs and things for kids, and I think we ought to do that. I'm not saying we don't. I think we do. That's part of our mission. But in doing so, we've created an environment where we've convinced people it's okay to drop kids off